To my mind, transpersonal consciousness is relevant more than ever before. It is even crucially relevant today. At the leading edge, at the cutting edge of the sciences, one is discovering that this kind of consciousness, which gives you an immediate access to things, events, to information, which is beyond the senses, beyond the immediate confines of the brain and mind, this kind of process is not merely imaginary, it has a basis in reality. It is basically a quantum process, a process operating by quantum resonance through to probably the very smallest elements of the neuronal substructures of the brain that can pick up from this great holographic field which carries information on all things, where all quanta are embedded in, where all living things are participating. We can pick up information from there, which is spontaneous. Used to be called a reserve only for medicine men and shamans and gurus and prophets. Now it's coming to the fore for more and more people. And it's of unparalleled importance. Why is it? For two reasons. One, because the change in consciousness is so important today. It's crucially, critically important. And second, because this change depends quite decisively on our being able to connect with each other, to connect with our environment, to connect with the planet, and with the human community on the planet. Let me address these points very briefly. Why I think consciousness is so important today. If you ask yourself, what is the root of the problems that we face today? We all know the problems. There are many problems. Climate change, global warming are only among the most visible ones. But there is also the availability of water, the rise of the sea level, the exhaustion of the fertile lands, the overcrowding of cities, the tremendous poverty and gap between the rich and the poor, the spread of diseases. We could make a whole list, and many people do make lists like that. These are trends that need to be turned around. Fortunately, they are trends for the most part that can be turned around. But you ask yourself, what is the root cause of all this? The answer has to be consciousness. The dominant, the typical consciousness of those elements of society that are in charge of the market, in charge of production and consumption, in charge of dictating, or at least suggesting, the lifestyles and therefore the values that people have. We behave in a bad way. We behave in an unsustainable way on this planet. We are destroying the very environment on which we depend. And why is that? If you ask yourself, what is the difference between a sustainable civilization, a sustainable society, and an unsustainable one? Clearly, it's the values. What are values based on? They're based on our view of ourselves, on our identity, on our perceived relationship with the world at large. And what in turn are these factors based on? Ultimately, they are based on the view of the world, on the concept of the world, on the dominant nature of our consciousness. If you have a consciousness which is typical of the Western world in the past 200, 250 years, then this is a materialist, reductionist consciousness. We are locked, according to this consciousness, into the tower, into our head, where we have 5 slits, the 5 senses through which we can see the world. This kind of consciousness creates separation between people and nature. And it creates the kind of problems that we have because it encourages people to fight, to struggle for their own interests, for their own survival, because it's only the fittest that survives. Darwin never actually said so much that only the fittest survived. For him, the fittest was the most adaptive, the most able to change. But for his followers, they adapted it in such a way that it says only the fit who is more powerful and more wealthy that will survive. This is not true, and this is a bad consciousness. Very well has been said by Thomas Huxley, the grandfather of Aldous Huxley and a great biologist, over 100 years ago. He said that when only the fittest survives, then the majority cannot be made fit to survive. Yet this is our problem today. The great majority is not fit to survive. And our task would be to make the great majority fit to survive, because we all either survive together or none of us will. So we have here a problem of consciousness. Overcoming the scientific consciousness, which is so mistaken. Not because the science is mistaken, but because it takes the wrong science. It takes the old-fashioned Newtonian science that was not really the science of Newton himself, but of his followers. It's the Darwinian science, which was not the science of Darwin again, but of his followers. This kind of consciousness is now bringing us to a series of problems that threaten our very survival on this planet. So we need to take a new action. We need to develop a new way of living. And we won't develop this new way of living only by putting in more money, by applying more technology, as long as we apply it with the same old ideas and same old values. We can only create a new world, a more sustainable and peaceful world, if we change our basic values, and if our values upon which they change, upon which they rest, themselves change, therefore our consciousness changes. What is the nature of the new consciousness? Let me say this very briefly, in one word: transpersonal. Transpersonal consciousness is the kind of consciousness we need to survive on this planet. Because a consciousness that's transpersonal is beyond the mind, is beyond the limits of the ego, beyond the limits of the body. It makes an individual a part of his community, his or her community, his or her environment. Doesn't make him or her separate as an island that is only connected by causal networks of mutual, or perhaps coinciding interests, but often conflicting interests with others. The kind of greed that we have in this world, about which Mahatma Gandhi said that we have enough in this world to respond to everybody's need, but not enough to even to respond to satisfy one person's greed. This kind of greed is based on a wrong consciousness. A transpersonal consciousness is one that opens the mind, opens consciousness to others, creates connection, creates empathy, creates sympathy, creates the kind of sense of belongingness, which is true always in all the great spiritual traditions. It's true of all the traditional societies. No non-Western, non-modern society ever existed in such a way that a small element, a small part of society would have, in terms of its own interest, destroyed the rest. Of course, what is happening today, this small portion of society that is destroying our environment and creating a gap between the rich and poor, doesn't do it voluntarily, doesn't do it willingly, doesn't do it consciously, but it does it by virtue of the fact that it acts as a cancer instead of acting as a productive part of society. Why do I say cancer? Because you see, typically a group of cells, which are cancerous, have a single program, and this is the program to reproduce themselves. They don't do anything else. They don't adapt to the system, to the organism. They only reproduce themselves. They grow. And they ultimately grow to the point where the organism can no longer support them and no longer is viable. Now, a small group of people who are rich and powerful and operate with the wrong consciousness are a kind of a cancer. They create wealth in the short term, but they create problems and unsustainability in the long term. They overexploit the environment. They take too much advantage of other people. Everything is operating in the short term selfish interest. This cannot work on a planet of nearly 7 billion people. we are where we're living very close to the outer limits of what is sustainable. If we are changing the climate, we are changing the balances of nature, and we are dependent on the current balances. These balances have evolved for the last 10,000 years, have been fairly stable since the last ice age, and all of human habitation, all of human livelihood, our food supplies, our water, our habitations patterns, all of these are based on these natural balances that have evolved in the last 10,000 years. If you now change them suddenly, sure enough there will be new balances coming about. But these new balances will not be able to support all of humanity. Maybe a portion, maybe nearer the Arctic zones and the Antarctic zones, where it's cooler. According to James Lovelock, the author of the Gaia theory, maybe not more than 1 billion people will be able to survive for the next 10,000 years on this planet. That's the pessimistic view. But James Lovelock doesn't take into account, or certainly not sufficiently into account, the possibility of consciousness change, of consciousness evolution. The change whereby we can develop a different way of acting, a different way of relating to each other and to nature. That is the big task before us. It's a feasible task. And it's not a hopeless, idealistic task. Because if we relate to each other with a sense of harmony, with a sense of belongingness, like traditional cultures, non-Western cultures always have. Sure enough, they have carried out wars and tribal conflicts with each other, but within communities, they have had a solidarity. Now we have a global community, and we need to have solidarity within that. So if we would act with this kind of consciousness, we would find the technologies, we'd find the economic systems, we'd find the financial system. All of these are available. They are possible. We have the know-how.